Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today I'm going to discuss how the detective in a mystery story is a Christ figure. Now, I need to give the disclaimer. When I say Christ figure, I'm not talking about playing Where's Waldo or looking for superficial similarities or having a decoder book that you, figure out the secret code with. I'm talking about where you see a character who relates to the rest of the characters in the plot, like how Christ relates to the world in some fashion. Christ figures are never, there'll be exceptions, like Aslan in the Chronicles of Narnia. But other than that, Christ figures are never complete. They're never, entirely Christ. They are just some aspect of Christ. And so what they shed light on is both some aspect of Christ within Christianity and also some aspect just of how, of the plot itself and how the world works. And that's why we identify a Christ figure in order to understand the story better. So, the detective is, in particular, like Christ prior to the crucifixion. So, the detective does not save the world through the self-sacrifice of one who is without sin. That's not it. It's more that Christ entered the world. God took on flesh. And then, prior to the crucifixion, teaches and also heals. He just fixed things, people's diseases, and so on, went around. You could almost say even unconsciously, like in the story of the woman with the brain hemorrhage, where she figured, if I can just touch his cloak, I'll be healed. And she did, and she was healed. And Jesus stopped and asked, who was it who touched me? I felt the power flowing out from me. Who touched me? It's fascinating, and I can't get into it, but the detective is a lot like that aspect of entering the world and then fixing it through the divine power. In this case, the divine power being reason, which incidentally is related to the Greek word logos, often translated as word. As in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's logos in the Greek. And it means a lot more than word, like rationality and thought and logic and reason. So, right there's a relationship, but also that aspect of the detective enters this world in the German sense of, the philosophical sense of Welt, of the person's ordinary experiences and the just sort of that somewhat self-contained thing. So you'll have a family or a group or business partners or whatever exactly, and the detective comes from outside of that into it, enters into this thing. He comes outside without the taint of the problem being had, and then through the right use of reason and a higher reason, then fixes that which was destroyed through the misuse of reason, that ordering of the world, the right relationships between the peoples that were introduced by the misuse of reason in the murder or theft or whatever. I'm probably going to stick to murder for the rest of this just because it's simpler, but the same thing applies. So, the detective in doing this is using reason rightly to restore the correct ordering of the world and restore the relationships that had been torn asunder by the misuse of reason. And so this is how the detective really is the Christ figure. And this is where, if you look over some of the historical rules for detective stories, like Father Ronald Knox's or S.S. Van Dyne's, there are a number of elements to them that more or less correspond to, you can kind of work it out. I haven't fully done this, but to some of the major Christian heresies, in where you find things like, for example, the prohibition on intuition. You see this in I think in both of those lists and in other places, that the detective can't simply magically know things. He's got to actually have evidence and use reason to do it. He can't just have an intuition that it's this person and then go check it out and it turns out to be. And the reason for that is that this destroys the structure of, the reason why that is bad in the detective story corresponds to destroying the structure of the Christ figure in the detective story, sort of actually along the lines of the Gnostic heresy of denying that Christ was in fact human. Gnosticism is more complicated than that. There's actually, often there's Jesus and there was the Christ being one of the pleroma, yada yada, complicated, and I don't want to get into a discussion of what Gnosticism is, but the point is that roughly it denied that the person crucified on the cross was in fact divine. and so it denied the homeostatic union, the union of natures, of Christ's human and divine nature in that one person. And so this the prohibition on intuition corresponds to that it requires that the detective be analogous to human in this sense. Just like Christ was, human as well as divine, having that rationality of gaining knowledge through the senses and then using reason to understand it. This is something that corresponds roughly to that heresy, and it also corresponds to a good detective story. Because it's not very interesting to just have somebody go along and go, aha, the author of this story has told me who did it. Well, okay, but that's not fun. That's not interesting. Makes for a bad detective story. And so this is sort of why it's interesting. There's sort of, curiously too, another thing about this, which is, it's a little bit difficult to explain it. I'm going to sort of just do this real quickly because I want this to not be a super long video. It's a little bit difficult to relate it to the Christ figure and a little bit easier just to relate it to the divine aspect. But the thing is, God loves the particular. God loves the particular very much. In fact, every individual particular thing, every beetle, every speck of dust, every comet that nobody sees too far away from the star to reflect enough light for anyone to ever notice. All of these things are immediately present to God in every moment because each one of these things is sustained in its existence by God. And so I've got a video called "God Loves the Beetles" on this subject, the insects, of which there are millions of species of them. Anyway, God loves the trivial, God loves the particular and the individual. And here too, the detective comes in order to know the particular. That where in general people tend to go astray is by dealing with things as if they are theoretical, as if they're generalities. That the police will suspect somebody simply because of a motive, and that motive classifies the person into the category of person with a motive or person with a strong motive. And then they interact not with the individual who did particular things, but with that generality. The detective does not interact with the generalities, but with the particulars. Does not operate by theories, but on the particular evidence, the particular person, the particular things done. And in this love of the particular, furthermore, we have this turning away from the general ideas of things to the particulars, and also the right use of reason, as I said, because of course the right use of reason is to use generalities to understand the particular. We arrive at generalities from the particular. There's some asterisks. And people focus on that a little bit too much, and it's way too easy for those who enjoy generalities to focus on the obtaining of the generality, to look at the particular and then to generalize from it and ignore those particulars because the generalities, the rules, the ideas are interesting. But the actual proper use of these things is to deal with the particular and understand it better. To understand the relationships of the particulars through the use of the general. And this is what the detective does and gets so right in comparison to whoever is bumbling. Often the police, but it can be a police detective, often other police people, or crowds, groups, whoever's accusing the wrong person. This is always the structure of it. They use the general instead of the particular. And the detective, with his love of the particular, comes and identifies the truth in the circumstance when the generalities are misleading. He uses the generalities correctly, but doesn't mistake them for the particular. And so again, this is related to Christ in teaching of things. And you can see this come up a bunch of times when Christ would explain to people to stop focusing so much on the general rules and to look at the particulars of a circumstance. Like, for example, in the healing of somebody on the Sabbath, when Christ famously said that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. That he took, there is this general rule about the Sabbath, and the general is useful in understanding the particular. This is not a doing away with of the rule, but that you have to deal with the particular as the particular, not just as the rule. And hence why he would cure a man on the Sabbath. That the rule was good in its generality, but it was general, it was not particular. And so in the particular, there will be things that I have to phrase this carefully, that violate the generality, not in the fullness of its spirit, but in the particular that the generality did not in fact encompass. So that is to say that he did not violate the rules, he did not throw out the rules, and Christ was very specific about this, that he was not throwing out the rules, but rather that he was fulfilling the rules, that he was broadening the application from the rules to the fullness of the particulars that would not violate the rule except as a misunderstanding and over-application of the generality that was the rule. And so you can see this very much again also in the detective, who does not throw away the rules. He doesn't say like, oh, people don't need motives. He just says that that he looks at the particulars and whether or not this motive actually was sufficient, not just for the generality of murder as a concept, but of this particular murder that actually happened with these particular aspects to it. So there are other things that can be said about this, to be sure, but I want to end it there in terms of how the detective is a Christ figure. It's a really interesting way of looking at it. It brings, it sheds a lot of light on the construction of the detective story and the construction of a good detective story. And if you look at detective stories that are unsatisfying, you will tend to see this violated in some fashion. If you look at the really good ones, you will tend to see this fulfilled rather well. So it really helps in understanding it. And, obviously my interest being that I write murder mysteries, is in no small part understanding them for the sake of writing them. But it's also, it enables you to get the most out of the things that you love. I love reading detective stories too. And, I certainly haven't stopped reading detective stories. And so understanding this about the structure really helps me to get as much from the detective stories as I can. So, until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.